The late afternoon sun filtered through the ancient elm trees surrounding the vicarage lawn in St. Mary Mead, casting gentle shadows across the pristine white tablecloths of the annual Garden Society exhibition. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly beneath a striped parasol, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm as she observed the pleasant bustle of village life unfolding before her. At her age, she had learned that the most fascinating dramas often played out during the most ordinary of occasions, and today's gathering promised to be particularly illuminating. The centerpiece of this year's exhibition was not the prize-winning roses or Mrs. Dollop's famous seed cake, but rather the presence of Mr. Sebastian Hartwell, the photographer who had recently taken residence in Ivy Cottage on the High Street. Mr. Hartwell was a man of perhaps 45, with the sort of carefully cultivated artistic appearance that suggested both talent and a certain awareness of his own importance. His silver-streaked hair was fashionably tousled. His expensive camera equipment spoke of professional success, and his manner with the villagers struck that delicate balance between charming interest and subtle condescension that marked him as unmistakably metropolitan. "Such a distinguished gentleman," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple with a teacup that rattled tellingly against its saucer. "Though I must confess, Jane, there's something rather intense about the way he looks at people, as if he's seeing more than one might wish him to see." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed her friend's gaze to where Mr. Hartwell was positioning his camera near the prize vegetable display. She had noticed the same quality, that particular way photographers had of studying their subjects as if cataloguing secrets. "Indeed, Dolly, I imagine his profession requires a certain perception of character, though one does wonder whether such perception is always welcome." The photographer had been commissioned by the village council to document the day's festivities for their upcoming promotional materials, but Miss Marple had observed that several residents seemed uncommonly nervous in his presence. Colonel Melchett, usually the most forthright of men, had developed a sudden fascination with the distant cricket pavilion whenever the camera turned his way. Dr. Haydock's jovial manner appeared strained as he posed reluctantly beside his prize marrows. Even young Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore, the bank manager's wife and undoubtedly the most photogenic resident of St. Mary Mead, seemed to find urgent business elsewhere whenever Mr. Hartwell's lens sought her out. "I understand he's had quite a successful career in London," Miss Marple ventured gently, her tone carrying the innocent curiosity that often encouraged confidences. Mrs. Bantry's teacup rattled again. "Oh yes, very successful indeed. Society portraits, theatrical photographs, that sort of thing. I believe he's even published books, artistic studies of people in their private moments, if you take my meaning." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned that he has quite a reputation for capturing what he calls authentic human nature. Apparently, his subjects don't always appreciate his interpretation of authenticity." Miss Marple understood perfectly. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that those who specialized in revealing truth often made themselves rather unpopular with those who preferred their secrets to remain buried. The camera, she reflected, could be as unforgiving as a mirror and considerably more permanent. As the afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm of village life, children shrieking with delight at the coconut shy, elderly residents comparing ailments over cucumber sandwiches, and the steady click of Mr. Hartwell's camera capturing it all, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She noticed how Mrs. Whitmore consistently managed to position herself behind other people when the photographer appeared. She observed the way Dr. Haydock's wife kept glancing anxiously at her husband whenever Mr. Hartwell drew near. Most intriguingly, she watched as the photographer himself grew increasingly animated as the afternoon wore on, as though he were gathering something far more valuable than simple promotional photographs. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the vicar, Reverend Clement, announced that Mr. Hartwell would conclude the day's documentation with a group portrait of all the attendees, a traditional finale to the Garden Society exhibition. The suggestion was met with polite enthusiasm, though Miss Marple noticed several forced smiles and caught more than one person glancing toward the garden gate, as if contemplating escape. "Now then, everyone," Mr. Hartwell called out with theatrical authority, positioning his camera on its tripod near the prize rose display. "If you could all gather here, please, a lovely memento of this charming afternoon." His voice carried that particular blend of professional efficiency and barely concealed impatience that suggested a man accustomed to being obeyed. As the villagers arranged themselves in the traditional formation, the vicar and his wife in the center, the prize winners prominently displayed, children seated cross-legged in front, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Something in Mr. Hartwell's manner had caught her attention, a particular intensity in his expression, a deliberate quality to his movements that suggested this final photograph held significance beyond mere documentation. The photographer made a great show of adjusting his equipment, checking the light, and positioning his subjects with exacting precision. "Perfect," he declared finally, ducking beneath the black cloth that covered his camera. "Everyone hold perfectly still. This will be one for the archives." The assembled villagers froze in their poses, smiles carefully maintained, children struggling not to fidget. The brass band, which had been providing gentle background music throughout the afternoon, fell silent in respectful anticipation. Even the birds seemed to pause their evening chorus. The expected click of the shutter never came. Instead, there was a strange, muffled sound from beneath the black cloth, something between a gasp and a sigh. The camera swayed slightly on its tripod. Then, with horrible deliberation, Mr. Hartwell's body pitched forward, his weight carrying the expensive equipment crashing to the ground in a tangle of metal, glass, and black fabric. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. For a moment, the posed villagers remained frozen, uncertain whether this was some sort of artistic statement or technical mishap. Then Mrs. Whitmore screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the pastoral tranquility like breaking glass. Dr. Haydock was the first to move, his medical training overriding social convention as he rushed to the fallen photographer. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he looked up, his face was grave. "I'm afraid Mr. Hartwell is dead," he announced quietly. "We must telephone the police immediately." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, the overturned camera with its shattered lens, the black cloth now serving as an impromptu shroud, the scattered villagers whose carefully maintained poses had dissolved into expressions of shock, fear, and, in some cases, something that might have been relief. The annual Garden Society exhibition had indeed concluded with a memorable photograph, though not at all the sort that anyone had anticipated. Mr. Sebastian Hartwell had taken his final exposure, and Miss Marple suspected that the developing process would reveal far more than anyone expected. The tranquil afternoon at the vicarage had been shattered as thoroughly as Mr. Hartwell's expensive camera lens. Within moments of Dr. Haydock's grave announcement, the carefully orchestrated social gathering dissolved into something resembling a disturbed ant-hill. The neat rows of chairs were abandoned, teacups sat cooling and forgotten, and the prize-winning roses seemed to droop under the weight of sudden tragedy. Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the drama unfolding before her. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the immediate aftermath of shocking events often revealed more truth than hours of careful questioning. Fear and surprise had a way of stripping away the polite veneer that usually governed village interactions, and she intended to observe every unguarded moment. Dr. Haydock, having covered the photographer's still form with the black cloth from his camera, was directing the scene with professional efficiency. "No one must touch anything until the police arrive," he instructed firmly, though his voice carried an undertone of concern that suggested Mr. Hartwell's death might not be the straightforward medical emergency everyone hoped it would prove to be. The theories began almost immediately, each villager offering their explanation with the confidence that comes from wanting desperately to make sense of the senseless. "Heart attack, surely," declared Mrs. Bantry, her voice carrying across the lawn with authority born of wishful thinking. A man of his age, all that excitement with the photography equipment. These artistic types are notoriously high-strung, you know. The stress simply overwhelmed his constitution. But Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to accept the simple explanation when a more dramatic one presented itself, shook her head with grim satisfaction. "Nonsense, Dolly. I observed him carefully during the refreshments. He was sampling everything with considerable enthusiasm. Mark my words, it was something he consumed. These modern catering arrangements are never as careful as they ought to be." Colonel Melchett, his military bearing somewhat undermined by nervous fidgeting, favored the accidental theory. Fellow was fussing about with all that equipment like a man possessed. Probably caught his foot in the tripod legs, brought the whole apparatus down on himself. These photographer chaps never watch where they're stepping. Young Mrs. Whitmore, still pale from her earlier screaming fit, was being comforted by the other village wives near the garden bench. "He made such an awful sound," she whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, like he was trying to say something important, but couldn't manage the words. It was quite dreadful. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham, accompanied by Constable Lake, brought a semblance of official order to the proceedings. Inspector Slack was a thin, energetic man who approached investigations with the enthusiasm of a terrier pursuing rats, though Miss Marple had observed that his eagerness sometimes led him to overlook subtleties that might prove significant. "Right then," Slack announced, surveying the scene with professional briskness. "Sudden death at a village gathering. These things are usually straightforward. Medical emergency, bit of excitement, weak constitution. Dr. Haydock, what's your preliminary assessment?" Dr. Haydock's response was carefully measured. "The collapse was very sudden, Inspector. No obvious external injuries, but his coloring was unusual. I'd prefer not to speculate until we know more." It was then that the more interesting conversations began to emerge. Near the garden gate, where several of the village's younger men had gathered in what they believed was private consultation, Miss Marple's sharp hearing caught fragments of a most illuminating discussion. "I'm telling you, something wasn't right about that fellow," Tom Whitmore, the bank manager, was saying in an agitated whisper. "The way he kept asking questions about people's business, poking around where he had no right to be. Just yesterday he came into the bank asking about property transactions from years past. Claimed it was for historical atmosphere in his photographs." "Historical atmosphere," scoffed Mr. Badger from the post office. "More like historical gossip, if you ask me. He was in my shop 3 times this week, casual as you please, asking who lived where and when, who'd had financial difficulties, who'd left the village suddenly. Said it was all for background research for his artistic project." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. In her experience, photographers who showed such intense interest in the private affairs of their subjects were often documenting considerably more than scenic beauty. The camera, she reflected, could serve as both artistic tool and weapon of remarkable power, particularly in the hands of someone who understood the true value of secrets in a small community like St. Mary Mead. The tranquil vicarage garden had transformed into something resembling a military operation under Inspector Slack's brisk direction. Constable Lake stretched a length of rope between the elm trees, creating a makeshift boundary around the fallen photographer and his scattered equipment, while the remaining villagers were gently but firmly shepherded toward the vicarage drawing room. Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided along with the others, though her pale blue eyes continued their careful cataloguing of every detail, every expression, every telling gesture that might prove significant. Dr. Haydock remained beside the covered form, his medical training keeping him focused on the immediate practicalities while others succumbed to speculation. Inspector Slack, after a cursory examination that left him looking thoughtful rather than satisfied, began the methodical process of questioning witnesses. His approach was direct and efficient, though Miss Marple suspected he was missing the subtler currents that flowed beneath the surface of village politeness. The drawing room buzzed with nervous energy as theories multiplied like rabbits in spring. Mrs. Bantry had elevated her heart attack hypothesis to near certainty, embellishing it with observations about Mr. Hartwell's artistic temperament and metropolitan constitution. Mrs. Price Ridley, never content with simple explanations, had moved beyond the medical to the moral, declaring that the photographer had been altogether too inquisitive for his own good. Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea service, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Clement with refreshments, but actually to observe the fascinating display of human nature unfolding around her. In her long experience, she had learned that people revealed far more about themselves in moments of crisis than in years of ordinary conversation. Fear had a way of stripping away the careful veneer that usually governed social interactions. Tom Whitmore, the bank manager, had grown increasingly pale as the afternoon progressed. His earlier agitation about Mr. Hartwell's inquiries regarding property records now seemed less like professional discretion and more like genuine alarm. He sat rigidly in the corner, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles showed white against his skin. "Such peculiar questions," he asked. Mrs. Clement murmured as she arranged cups on a tray. "Yesterday he wanted to examine our parish registers, marriages, deaths, baptisms going back decades. Claimed it was for atmospheric background for his photographs, but there was something in his manner that made me quite uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while noting how several conversations had paused at Mrs. Clement's words. Colonel Melchett's military bearing had developed a distinct stiffness, and she observed his quick glance toward Dr. Haydock, a look that suggested shared knowledge of something unpleasant. Through the French doors, she could see Inspector Slack examining the photographer's equipment with methodical thoroughness. The expensive camera lay in pieces, its lens shattered, but it was the black focusing cloth that seemed to hold his particular attention. Miss Marple had noticed earlier that Dr. Haydock had pulled the cloth free to cover the body, and she remembered observing what appeared to be stains on the fabric. Not the sort of marks one would expect from purely photographic work. Young Mrs. Whitmore had composed herself admirably since her initial screaming fit, though Miss Marple detected something theatrical in her continued distress. The young woman's consistent avoidance of Mr. Hartwell's camera throughout the afternoon had been notable, and her current behavior suggested someone more concerned with managing impressions than expressing genuine grief. Dr. Haydock mentioned something about chemical stains. Miss Marple ventured quietly to Mrs. Clement. On Mr. Hartwell's hands. Rather curious for someone who was supposedly only taking photographs today. Mrs. Clement looked startled. Chemical stains. But surely photographers don't develop their pictures immediately. I thought that was done later, in special rooms with all sorts of equipment. Indeed, Miss Marple reflected. That was precisely the point. Fresh chemical stains suggested that Mr. Hartwell had been engaged in more than simple photography during his time in St. Mary Mead. The implications were intriguing and potentially damning for someone in the village. Inspector Slack's voice carried from the garden as he directed Constable Lake to collect what appeared to be a small vial that had rolled beneath the prize roses. The container seemed oddly out of place among the photographic equipment, and Miss Marple observed several sharp intakes of breath from her fellow villagers when the inspector held it up to the light. The afternoon, shadows were lengthening, casting the garden in increasingly dramatic patterns of light and dark. The golden hour that photographers prized for its flattering qualities was fading into something more ominous, and Miss Marple found herself thinking that Mr. Hartwell's final photograph might indeed prove to be his most revealing, though not in any way he could have anticipated. As Inspector Slack returned to the drawing room with his notebook and a grim expression, Miss Marple settled back into her chair with her knitting. The real investigation, she suspected, was only just beginning, and the truth would emerge not from official questioning but from the careful observation of human nature under pressure. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters in the vicar's book-lined study, the scent of old leather and beeswax polish providing a strangely comforting backdrop to what was rapidly becoming a most uncomforting investigation. His notebook filled steadily as he methodically questioned each witness, his pencil scratching with the confidence of a man who believed that systematic inquiry would inevitably yield systematic results. The small glass vial found beneath the prize roses sat prominently on the desk beside him, its dark residue catching the lamplight like an accusation waiting to be voiced. Tom Whitmore was summoned first, his usual banker's composure having deserted him entirely. One sleeve was wrinkled, his tie sat askew, and his hands trembled slightly as he answered Inspector Slack's increasingly pointed questions. Yes, Mr. Hartwell had visited the bank several times during the past week. No, their conversations had not been entirely pleasant. The photographer had been remarkably persistent in his inquiries about historical property transactions, particularly those involving the old Grayson estate. He claimed it was research for his photographic project, Whitmore explained, his voice strained. Said he wanted to understand the authentic history of village properties, but his questions were far too specific too. Knowing. He asked about irregularities in the Grayson sale, about advanced knowledge of development plans, about profits that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose with interest. The Grayson affair had been one of those village scandals that simmered beneath the surface for years. Old Mr. Grayson's sudden death, the hasty sale of his property, and the considerable profits that certain residents had mysteriously acquired when the land was subsequently developed. And you told him what exactly? That bank records are confidential, Whitmore replied, though his tone lacked conviction. But he seemed to know more than he should have. He mentioned specific dates, specific amounts. It was as though he had already obtained the information elsewhere and was simply confirming details. The revelation that followed was even more damaging. A search of Ivy Cottage had revealed Mr. Hartwell's true purpose in St. Mary Mead. His photographic equipment was merely a convenient cover for what appeared to be an extensive blackmail operation. Hidden beneath innocent landscape studies were detailed notes about village residents, carefully documented observations about their private affairs, and most damning of all, draft letters demanding payment for his discretion regarding various sensitive matters. Dr. Haydock, summoned to examine the vial more closely, confirmed Inspector Slack's suspicions about the cause of death. The residue suggests a fast-acting poison, he announced gravely, something that could induce rapid cardiac failure while leaving few obvious traces. The sort of substance that would be available to someone with medical knowledge or access to pharmaceutical supplies. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her corner chair, noted the doctor's visible discomfort as he made this pronouncement. His professional detachment seemed strained, and she detected something in his manner that suggested personal concern rather than purely clinical interest. Her pale blue eyes also caught the quick glance he exchanged with Colonel Melchett, a look that spoke of shared knowledge about matters best left undiscussed. Furthermore, Inspector Slack continued, consulting his notes with obvious satisfaction. We discovered that Mr. Hartwell had been making inquiries beyond simple property records. He visited the parish church to examine marriage and death certificates, questioned Mrs. Bartlett about residents who had left the village suddenly, and showed particular interest in any medical incidents from years past that might have been misunderstood at the time. The implications hung heavy in the drawing-room air. Mrs. Bantry's teacup rattled against its saucer with renewed vigor, while Mrs. Price Ridley straightened in her chair with the expression of someone whose instinct for drama had been thoroughly vindicated. Young Mrs. Whitmore, pale and trembling, pressed her handkerchief to her lips as though to prevent unwanted words from escaping. Miss Marple observed that the young woman's distress seemed genuine enough, though there was something calculated in the way she positioned herself to best advantage in the lamplight, a habit perhaps from her theatrical days that even genuine emotion could not entirely suppress. "The evidence points quite clearly to blackmail as the motive," Inspector Slack declared. "Mr. Hartwell had discovered something that someone in this village was desperate to keep hidden, desperate enough to commit murder to ensure his silence." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily as she considered the inspector's confident assessment. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that blackmailers rarely limited themselves to a single victim. If Mr. Hartwell had indeed been operating such a scheme, there might well be multiple residents with cause to wish him silenced. The challenge would be determining which secret was dangerous enough to warrant murder, and which resident possessed both the means and the resolve to act upon their desperation. The afternoon shadows were lengthening now, casting the vicarage garden in increasingly dramatic patterns of light and dark. Through the French doors, she could see Constable Lake still guarding the scene where Mr. Hartwell had taken his final photograph. The irony was not lost on her that a man who specialized in exposing hidden truths had himself become the subject of the most revealing exposure of all. As Inspector Slack prepared to make what appeared to be an arrest, Miss Marple found herself thinking that the real mystery was only just beginning to develop, like one of Mr. Hartwell's photographs emerging slowly in its chemical bath, revealing details that had been invisible to the naked eye. Inspector Slack's investigation had reached what he considered a satisfactory conclusion, with Tom Whitmore emerging as the primary suspect in Mr. Hartwell's death. The bank manager's nervous demeanor, combined with his withdrawal of £50 the previous day and his obvious distress over the photographer's inquiries into the Grayson property dealings, painted a compelling picture of a man driven to desperate measures. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by details that seemed to resist such tidy resolution. The small glass vial that Constable Lake had discovered beneath the prize roses continued to occupy her thoughts, not for what it contained, but for where it had been found. If Mr. Hartwell had indeed been poisoned by something he had consumed, the container should logically have remained closer to his person, perhaps dropped from nerveless fingers or found in his immediate vicinity. Instead, it lay several feet away, positioned almost deliberately among Mrs. Clement's award-winning blooms, as though placed there for convenient discovery. More intriguing still was the black focusing cloth that Dr. Haydock had used to cover the photographer's body. Mrs. Clement, in her instinctive tidiness, had retrieved and shaken the fabric over the garden before folding it neatly on a side chair. Miss Marple had observed the action with interest, noting the faint, bitter odor that had risen from the cloth, something reminiscent of the old-fashioned garden treatments that experienced gardeners still favored over modern preparations. "The nicotine solution," she murmured to herself, her pale blue eyes focusing on the memory of that distinctive smell. In her youth, every serious gardener had kept bottles of the concentrated tobacco extract for dealing with aphids and other garden pests. The solution was remarkably effective and equally dangerous. A few drops could prove fatal if absorbed through the skin or inhaled in concentration. Dr. Haydock's earlier observation about chemical stains on Mr. Hartwell's hands took on new significance when considered alongside the photographer's working methods. Miss Marple had watched him throughout the afternoon, noting his meticulous attention to his equipment and his habit of making repeated adjustments beneath the focusing cloth. A photographer's work required intimate contact with his camera, hands constantly touching lenses and mechanisms, face pressed close to viewfinders in the enclosed space beneath the black fabric. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was constructing his case against Tom Whitmore with methodical determination. "The motive is clear enough," he declared to the assembled villagers. Hartwell was blackmailing him over irregularities in the Grayson sale. The man was desperate to protect his reputation and his position at the bank. But Miss Marple's attention had drifted to the garden beyond the French doors, where the old tool shed stood with its door slightly ajar. Mr. Whodunit, the elderly gardener, was notoriously forgetful about securing his supplies, and the vicar had mentioned only recently the need to properly lock away the more dangerous substances. The concentrated nicotine solution, in particular, required careful handling, a fact that any experienced gardener would know intimately. The murder method was becoming clearer in her mind, though the identity of the murderer remained frustratingly elusive. Someone had gained access to the old garden chemicals. Someone had applied the deadly solution to Mr. Hartwell's camera equipment, most likely the inner surface of the focusing cloth or the eyepiece of the viewfinder itself. The photographer's own meticulous habits had ensured his exposure to the poison during those final, fatal moments beneath the black fabric. Young Mrs. Whitmore sat pale and trembling in her corner chair, her handkerchief pressed to her lips as though to prevent unwanted words from escaping. Miss Marple noticed the faint brownish stains on the lace fabric, stains that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the marks she had observed on the focusing cloth. The young woman's theatrical background would have given her familiarity with stage makeup and chemical preparations, knowledge that could easily extend to more sinister applications. Colonel Melchett paced restlessly near the window, his relief at Tom Whitmore's arrest almost palpable. Dr. Haydock maintained his professional composure, though Miss Marple detected something in his manner that suggested knowledge he was reluctant to share. Even Mrs. Price Ridley seemed oddly subdued, as though the reality of murder in their peaceful village had finally penetrated her usual dramatic sensibilities. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort Tom Whitmore to the police station, Miss Marple found herself thinking that the photographer's final exposure might indeed prove to be his most revealing, though not in any way he could have anticipated. The truth, like one of his photographs, was slowly developing in the chemical bath of village secrets, and she suspected the final image would surprise everyone involved. The evening shadows lengthened across the vicarage garden, casting the scene of Mr. Hartwell's death in increasingly dramatic patterns of light and darkness, while the real mystery continued to develop in the patient mind of St. Mary Mead's most observant resident. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a shroud, muffling the anxious conversations that continued long after Inspector Slack's motor car had disappeared down the high street with Tom Whitmore in custody. The arrest should have brought relief to the villagers, yet Miss Marple observed quite the opposite effect taking hold. The remaining residents displayed not satisfaction at justice served, but rather the heightened nervousness of people who suspected their secrets remained dangerously exposed. Miss Marple excused herself from the drawing-room with a gentle word about retrieving her knitting from the terrace, but her true destination was the old tool shed that stood with its door slightly ajar in the gathering dusk. Mr. Whodunit, the elderly gardener, was methodically arranging bottles on a weathered shelf, their faded labels resembling ghosts of ink in the lamplight. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, startled but pleased by her visit. "Dreadful business, this. Never thought to see murder among the prize roses." "One never does expect such things," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I wonder, Mr. Whodunit, if you happen to keep the old nicotine wash. For greenfly, you know." "Indeed I do," he replied, indicating a narrow brown bottle with reverent care. "Best treatment there is, though folks nowadays prefer those modern powders that blow about and accomplish nothing. This here's concentrated. Dangerous stuff if you don't respect it." He touched his temple meaningfully. "Could kill a man if he weren't careful." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "And might one ask, did anyone require some this afternoon? A gardening emergency, perhaps?" The old man frowned, searching his memory. "Now that you mention it, there was quite a fuss about the prize roses. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she'd spotted black fly thick as soot and insisted I provide something immediately. Drew her a small amount in a chemist's bottle with a cork. Told her to dab, not splash, mind you." "A chemist's bottle," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. with blue string around the neck, perhaps. That's my usual practice, but I'd run out of string that morning, meant to remedy it later, but with all the excitement. He shrugged apologetically. Miss Marple nodded, understanding perfectly. The small vial Inspector Slack had discovered beneath the roses was beginning to make more sense, though not in the way the inspector imagined. As she prepared to leave, her attention was caught by a square of black cloth draped over a nearby stool. One of Mr. Bowden's dust covers. The faintest, bitter odor clung to it, layered oddly with something floral and old-fashioned. "How curious," she murmured, "the way scents linger. Your nicotine solution and, oh my, lavender. Such a distinctive combination." Returning to the garden, Miss Marple paused beside the toppled camera equipment, where the photographer's focusing cloth lay neatly folded by Mrs. Clement's thorough hands. She bent carefully and brought the fabric closer to her nose. Yes, unmistakable. The bitter reek of tobacco extract, but beneath it, the unmistakable scent of lavender water and something else that made her frown with concentration. Her quiet investigation was interrupted by Mrs. Bantry, who appeared from behind the lilac bush with the guilty expression of someone who had witnessed something not intended for her eyes. "Jane," she whispered urgently, "you'll think me a dreadful gossip, but I did observe Mrs. Price Ridley handling that cloth during the photograph session. She claimed it was to prevent drafts, as if cameras caught cold. But there was something odd about her manner, quite furtive, actually." Miss Marple's mind, however, was moving in a different direction entirely. The £50 Tom Whitmore had withdrawn felt too obvious, too convenient for a blackmailer of Mr. Hartwell's apparent sophistication. A man of the bank manager's financial acumen would hardly deliver blackmail payment in such a transparent manner. It felt like a red herring, deliberately placed to draw attention away from a deeper, more complex truth. Her thoughts returned to that crucial moment during the group photograph, just before Mr. Hartwell had ducked beneath the focusing cloth. She had observed Mrs. Whitmore, who had spent the entire afternoon avoiding the camera, positioned directly in front of the photographer for that final shot. As he made his last adjustments, the young woman had reached forward, ostensibly to straighten a child's collar, but her hand had brushed against the camera assembly with practiced precision before quickly retreating. The movement had been so subtle, so rehearsed, that it had nearly escaped notice entirely. But coupled with Mrs. Whitmore's theatrical background and the brownish stains Miss Marple had observed on her handkerchief, a chilling possibility began to emerge. What if the poison hadn't been delivered through the focusing cloth at all, but through the camera itself? What if, instead of a liquid solution, the murder weapon had been something far more insidious? A finely ground powder, perhaps, applied directly to the viewfinder where Mr. Hartwell would press his face in those final, fatal moments. Miss Marple recalled an old cautionary tale from her youth about traveling photographers who had used irritant powders to create dramatic effects in their portraits. Such substances, when properly concentrated, could prove lethal if inhaled in an enclosed space. The photographer's sudden, silent collapse made perfect sense if he had breathed in a carefully prepared dose of poison powder while positioning his shot. Mrs. Whitmore's theatrical training would have given her both the knowledge of such substances and the ability to apply them with the precision of a stage magician. Her consistent avoidance of the camera throughout the afternoon now seemed less like shyness and more like careful positioning for that crucial final moment. As the evening shadows lengthened across the vicarage garden, Miss Marple reflected that Inspector Slack's arrest of Tom Whitmore might actually serve the real murderer's purposes perfectly. The obvious suspect was in custody, the investigation appeared closed, and the secrets that had driven someone to murder remained safely buried beneath the convenient explanation of financial blackmail. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most carefully constructed deceptions often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The photographer's death had been intended to silence him permanently, but instead had merely ensured that his secrets would be revealed through official investigation rather than private extortion. The killer had succeeded in eliminating the immediate threat, but the evidence of their crime was still developing, like one of Mr. Hartwell's photographs emerging slowly in its chemical bath, revealing details that had been invisible to the naked eye. The real question now was not whether Tom Whitmore was innocent. Miss Marple was increasingly certain he was, but whether she could prove the identity of the true murderer before they realized how much their carefully planned crime had actually exposed. The morning brought developments that should have satisfied Inspector Slack's methodical nature, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by their convenient precision. Word had arrived from Much Benham that Tom Whitmore had provided what the inspector termed clarifying details about his confrontation with Mr. Hartwell, including an admission that he had carried a small bottle of concentrated pesticide intended for his prize fuchsias. The explanation felt altogether too neat, like a theatrical prop positioned precisely where the audience would notice it. Miss Marple's contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Lake, who appeared at her cottage door with the breathless urgency of a man bearing significant news. "There's been a break-in at Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack requests that witnesses from yesterday be available to examine certain items that were disturbed." The scene at the photographer's residence revealed a methodical search conducted by someone intimately familiar with both the house's layout and the value of specific documents. Muddy footprints led from a forced scullery window to the sitting room, where someone had attempted to burn papers in the grate before the rain had doused their efforts. Most tellingly, the intruder had paused to remove their shoes before proceeding further into the house, a gesture that spoke of someone comfortable enough to take such domestic precautions. "The ledger containing his financial arrangements has been taken," Inspector Slack announced with satisfaction, along with a packet of photographic negatives. Clearly, our murderer feared what official examination might reveal. Among the salvaged items, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a partially burned photograph showing the moments before the group portrait. The image captured a woman's gloved hand withdrawing from the vicinity of Mr. Hartwell's camera equipment, a detail that would have been invisible to casual observation, but devastating under official scrutiny. Dr. Haydock, summoned to advise on the safe handling of chemical residues, appeared unusually subdued as he examined the photographer's makeshift darkroom. "Miss Marple," he confided quietly, "I must tell you that Hartwell approached me several days ago with questions about old Mr. Grayson's death. He seemed to possess information suggesting that certain medical assessments from that time might have been influenced by considerations beyond purely clinical judgment." The implications were staggering. If Mr. Hartwell had uncovered evidence of medical malpractice connected to the profitable Grayson property dealings, the photographer's blackmail operation would have encompassed far more than simple financial irregularities. Professional reputations built over decades could be destroyed by such revelations, providing motives for murder that extended well beyond Tom Whitmore's banking indiscretions. Yet Miss Marple found herself focusing on smaller, more telling details. The scent of lavender water lingered faintly in the cottage's sitting room, despite the acrid chemical odors from the dark room. More significantly, she observed paint scuffs on the forced windowsill that suggested a narrow, fashionable heel, the sort favored by women with theatrical training who understood the importance of maintaining elegant lines even under stress. "Inspector," she ventured gently, "might one inquire whether Mr. Whitmore's confession included details about how he administered the poison? The method would seem to require considerable knowledge of photographic equipment and chemical preparations." Slack's confident expression wavered slightly. "He claims to have applied the pesticide to the camera's eyepiece during their argument, though he's somewhat vague about the technical aspects." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though privately she found this explanation inadequate. The precise application of poison powder to photographic equipment would require familiarity with both chemicals and cameras that Tom Whitmore simply did not possess. Someone with theatrical experience, however, would understand both the properties of various powders and the mechanics of stage effects that could prove lethal when applied with professional precision. As they prepared to leave Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple noticed a fragment of photographic negative that had escaped the fire. A ghostly image showing theatrical masks and the partial letters J.T. in an ornate stage-style font. The connection to Mrs. Whitmore's theatrical background was becoming impossible to ignore, though she suspected the young woman's guilt might prove more complex than simple murder for personal gain. The real question was whether someone was deliberately manipulating the investigation, using Tom Whitmore's obvious guilt about financial matters to deflect attention from a far more sophisticated crime. The photographer's death had been intended to silence dangerous knowledge, but instead had merely ensured that village secrets would be exposed through official channels rather than private extortion. Miss Marple reflected that Mr. Hartwell's final photograph was indeed proving to be his most revealing exposure, developing slowly in the chemical bath of official investigation to show details that had been invisible to the naked eye. The morning brought a development that should have satisfied Inspector Slack's methodical nature, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by its convenient timing. Word had arrived from Much Benham that additional evidence had been discovered in Tom Whitmore's study, a small bottle of concentrated garden pesticide and what appeared to be notes about Mr. Hartwell's blackmail demands. The bank manager's guilt seemed increasingly certain, though Miss Marple detected something theatrical in the way each piece of evidence appeared precisely when needed to support the inspector's theory. Her contemplations were interrupted by an urgent summons from Dr. Haydock, who had spent the early morning hours examining the photographer's remaining equipment with the thoroughness that his medical training demanded. What he had discovered in Mr. Hartwell's makeshift darkroom cast the entire investigation in a disturbing new light. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, as they stood in the cottage's sitting room, "I must confess that Hartwell's interest in village affairs extended far beyond simple photography. Among his papers, I found detailed medical inquiries, not just about the Grayson case, but about several deaths over the past decade that might have benefited from more thorough investigation." The implications hung heavy in the morning air. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with understanding as Dr. Haydock continued his reluctant revelation. The photographer had been systematically documenting what appeared to be a pattern of convenient deaths, each accompanied by medical assessments that had prevented deeper scrutiny and allowed certain residents to profit considerably from the deceased's estates. The Grayson affair was merely the most recent, Dr. Haydock admitted, his professional composure strained. Hartwell had uncovered evidence suggesting that medical reports had been influenced by considerations beyond purely clinical judgment. He possessed copies of original assessments that differed significantly from the final, official versions. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind connecting threads that had seemed unrelated until now. The photographer's intense interest in parish records, his questions about residents who had left the village suddenly, his particular focus on property transactions following deaths, all suggested someone building a comprehensive case rather than simply seeking targets for casual extortion. "And might one inquire," she ventured gently, "whether any current residents were involved in these historical irregularities?" Dr. Haydock's silence was more revealing than any confession. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, such a pattern would necessarily involve multiple conspirators. Someone to provide medical cover, someone to handle financial arrangements, someone to ensure official processes proceeded smoothly. The photographer's blackmail operation had threatened to expose not individual secrets, but a systematic corruption that had enriched several prominent villagers over many years. As they prepared to leave Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a detail that others had overlooked. Among the photographer's scattered papers lay a theatrical program from the Jubilee Touring Company, with the initials J.T. prominently displayed in ornate script. More significantly, someone had made careful notations in the margins, dates, locations, and what appeared to be financial figures that corresponded suspiciously with the timeline of convenient deaths Dr. Haydock had described. The connection to Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore's theatrical background was becoming impossible to ignore, though Miss Marple suspected the young woman's involvement might prove more complex than simple participation in murder. The theatrical world, with its transient populations and flexible moral boundaries, would provide ideal cover for someone seeking to establish new identities or escape inconvenient histories. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Lake, who bore news that cast Tom Whitmore's confession in an entirely different light. The bank manager, it seemed, had been visited in his cell by his wife, who had emerged from the interview in a state of considerable distress. More intriguingly, she had left behind a small leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be additional evidence of her husband's guilt, evidence that seemed remarkably convenient in its completeness and timing. "Inspector Slack is quite pleased," Constable Lake reported. "Says it confirms everything he suspected about the case. But Dr. Haydock here seemed to think you might find it interesting." Miss Marple examined the portfolio with the care it deserved. The documents it contained were indeed damning: detailed records of Tom Whitmore's financial dealings, correspondence that seemed to document his blackmail arrangement with Mr. Hartwell, even a confession written in what appeared to be the bank manager's own hand. Yet something about the collection troubled her deeply. The handwriting, while superficially similar to Tom Whitmore's usual script, showed subtle variations that suggested someone with theatrical training, someone accustomed to mimicking others' writing styles for stage purposes. More tellingly, the paper bore the faint scent of lavender water, the same distinctive fragrance that had lingered around Mr. Hartwell's camera equipment and in various locations where the real murderer had left their mark. As the morning shadows lengthened across the photographer's cottage garden, Miss Marple reflected that Mr. Hartwell's final exposure was indeed proving to be his most revealing. The developing image showed not a simple case of blackmail and murder, but a carefully orchestrated campaign to eliminate a dangerous threat while ensuring that blame fell upon a convenient scapegoat. Someone was directing this investigation with the skill of a theatrical producer, ensuring that each dramatic revelation concealed more than it exposed. The photographer's death had been intended to silence dangerous knowledge, but instead had merely ensured that village secrets would be exposed through official channels rather than private extortion. The real question now was not whether Tom Whitmore was innocent. Miss Marple was increasingly certain he was, but whether she could prove the identity of the true conspirators before they completed their careful manipulation of justice. The game was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour, and she suspected that anyone who threatened to expose the truth might find themselves facing the same fate as the unfortunate photographer. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who arrived with the breathless urgency of someone who had discovered something both illuminating and deeply troubling. In her trembling hands, she carried a small leather portfolio that had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the vicarage attic, a hiding place she had discovered quite by accident while retrieving seasonal decorations. "I hardly know what to make of it, Miss Marple," she whispered, settling into the familiar chintz armchair with obvious distress. "I found this among some papers that belonged to my predecessor's wife. She died so suddenly, you remember, just after we arrived in St. Mary Mead. Everyone said it was her heart, but these documents suggested something rather more sinister." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest as she examined the portfolio's contents. Among the carefully preserved papers were several letters written in an elegant theatrical hand, the sort of penmanship that suggested training in dramatic presentation. More significantly, the correspondence bore the persistent scent of lavender water that had become increasingly familiar throughout this investigation. The letters detailed a pattern of intimidation against the former vicar's wife, who had apparently been asking uncomfortable questions about irregularities in the parish burial records. Someone had been pressuring her to cease her inquiries into certain deaths that had occurred under convenient circumstances, deaths that had allowed property to change hands profitably without the inconvenience of thorough investigation. The poor woman was terrified. Mrs. Clement continued, her voice barely above a whisper. These letters threatened not just her safety, but her husband's position in the church. They claimed she was meddling in affairs beyond her understanding and warned of serious consequences if she persisted. Miss Marple noted the distinctive flourishes in the handwriting, particularly the ornate initial J that appeared as a signature on several of the more threatening communications. The script matched marginalia she had observed in Mr. Hartwell's papers, connecting to the theatrical program from the Jubilee Touring Company that had featured so prominently in the photographer's research. As they examined the documents together, the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path announced another visitor. Through the lace curtains, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore making her way toward the cottage door, her usual graceful composure showing signs of strain. The young woman's timing seemed more than coincidental, arriving just as evidence of her past activities was being discussed. "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said gently, "might I suggest you take these papers directly to Inspector Slack? I believe he would find them most illuminating, particularly in light of recent developments." After Mrs. Clement's hasty departure through the kitchen garden, Miss Marple welcomed Mrs. Whitmore with her customary courtesy, though her observant eyes missed nothing of the visitor's agitated state. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she accepted tea, and her usual theatrical poise seemed to require conscious effort to maintain. "Such dreadful business about poor Mr. Hartwell," Mrs. Whitmore began, her voice carrying a forced lightness. "And now poor Tom arrested for something I'm certain he could never have done. The whole village seems to have gone quite mad with suspicion and fear." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while noting the faint stains on Mrs. Whitmore's gloves, brownish marks that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the chemical residues Dr. Haydock had observed on the photographer's equipment. "Indeed, my dear. One does wonder how such terrible events come to pass in a peaceful place like St. Mary Mead, though I suppose every village has its secrets, doesn't it?" The observation seemed to strike Mrs. Whitmore with particular force. Her teacup rattled against its saucer, and Miss Marple detected the unmistakable scent of lavender water that had lingered around so many crucial pieces of evidence. The young woman's theatrical background was becoming impossible to ignore, particularly when considered alongside the mounting evidence of her connection to the mysterious J.T., whose activities had so concerned the late photographer. "Secrets have a way of surfacing eventually," Miss Marple continued in her gentle manner. "Rather like photographs developing in their chemical baths, details that were invisible to the naked eye slowly becoming clear and undeniable." Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked visibly at this observation. Her carefully maintained expression dissolved into something approaching panic, and she rose abruptly from her chair as though preparing to flee. "I'm afraid I must go, Miss Marple. There are arrangements to be made. For Tom's defense, you understand." As the young woman hurried away, Miss Marple reflected that Mr. Hartwell's final photograph was indeed proving to be his most revealing exposure. The developing image showed not merely a simple case of blackmail and murder, but a far more complex picture involving systematic deception, historical crimes, and a conspiracy that had been operating successfully for years under the cover of village respectability. The photographer's death had been intended to silence a dangerous investigation, but instead had merely ensured that the truth would emerge through different channels. Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove more shocking than anyone anticipated, exposing not just one murderer, but an entire network of corruption that had taken root in their peaceful community. The morning shadows were lengthening across her garden as she prepared to visit Inspector Slack with her own observations about the case, confident that the truth was finally beginning to develop with a clarity that Mr. Hartwell himself would have appreciated. The afternoon light filtered through the vicarage drawing-room windows as Miss Marple arranged what she privately considered her final performance in this particular drama. Inspector Slack had reluctantly agreed to gather the principal figures, ostensibly to clarify certain discrepancies in the evidence against Tom Whitmore. The assembled group presented a study in barely concealed anxiety, Dr. Haydock maintaining professional composure despite obvious strain, Colonel Melchett pacing with military precision that failed to disguise his discomfort, and Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore, whose theatrical poise had developed visible cracks since their morning conversation. Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair, her knitting needles moving with customary rhythm as she began her gentle exposition. "Inspector, the evidence against Mr. Whitmore is indeed remarkable in its completeness, perhaps too remarkable if one considers human nature carefully. In my experience, genuine crimes rarely present themselves with such convenient clarity." She paused to examine her stitches, allowing the observation to settle like morning mist. Mr. Hartwell's death was carefully planned, but not by poor Mr. Whitmore, who lacks both the knowledge and temperament for such sophisticated murder. The real killer understood photography, chemistry, and most importantly, human psychology well enough to construct an elaborate deception. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, the movement drawing Miss Marple's attention to faint brownish stains that persisted despite obvious cleaning attempts. The poison was administered through Mr. Hartwell's camera equipment, specifically the eyepiece where he would press his face during those final moments. Someone with theatrical experience would understand both the properties of various powders and the mechanics of stage effects that could prove lethal when applied with professional precision. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably. "But surely the financial blackmail provides clear motive." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Mr. Hartwell was investigating the Grayson property dealings, but his real interest lay in a pattern of convenient deaths over many years, each accompanied by medical assessments that prevented deeper scrutiny. The photographer had discovered that several prominent villagers had been systematically profiting from these deaths, protected by falsified reports and manipulated proceedings. The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Melchett ceased his pacing entirely, while Dr. Haydock's composure showed significant strain. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved gently from face to face, noting each reaction with scientific precision. The conspiracy required multiple participants, she continued mildly. Someone to provide medical cover, someone to handle financial arrangements, someone to ensure official processes proceeded without inconvenient questions. When Mr. Hartwell threatened exposure, the conspirators faced ruin that made murder seem preferable to discovery. She reached into her knitting basket and withdrew a small spool of violet silk thread. "Mrs. Whitmore, my dear, would you thread this needle? My eyes aren't what they were, and you have such a delicate touch." The request seemed innocent enough, yet Mrs. Whitmore's gloved fingers went instinctively to her reticule before checking mid-motion. Why, Miss Marple? I scarcely ever sew." "Not on tour, surely," Miss Marple observed gently. "Every theatrical dresser knows violet silk disappears against pale kid gloves. I noticed the careful mending on your right glove, just where a finger might graze a camera's eyepiece while applying a fine powder." The accusation hung in the afternoon air like smoke. Mrs. Whitmore rose abruptly, her facade finally cracking. "You don't understand," she whispered, voice carrying desperate quality. "They threatened everything, Tom's position, our future, our very lives. The vicar's wife had started asking questions about burial records just like Hartwell. When she refused to stop her inquiries, the confession poured forth with inevitable force. Mrs. Whitmore, formerly Miss Judith Thornton of the Jubilee Touring Company, had been recruited years earlier to assist with systematic exploitation of elderly residents. Her theatrical skills made her invaluable for gaining victims' trust, while her knowledge of stage chemicals provided means for ensuring deaths appeared natural. Hartwell recognized me from an old program, she continued, tears streaming. He had been building a case against the entire operation, documenting every suspicious death, every falsified report, every profitable transaction. We couldn't let him destroy everything we had worked to build. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as Inspector Slack moved to make the long-overdue arrest. The lavender water was meant to disguise chemical odors, she observed quietly. A thoughtful touch, almost kind. But scent lingers, my dear, just as secrets do. As Mrs. Whitmore was led away, her theatrical composure finally abandoned, Miss Marple reflected that Mr. Hartwell's final photograph had indeed proved his most revealing exposure. The developing image showed not merely murder, but an entire system of corruption operating under village respectability's cover. The photographer's death had been intended to preserve that system, but instead ensured its complete exposure through patient observation of human nature under pressure. Justice, Miss Marple thought, often developed slowly but with remarkable clarity when given sufficient time and proper attention to detail. The drawing room of the vicarage had witnessed many revelations that afternoon, yet Miss Marple sensed that Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore's tearful confession represented merely the visible portion of a much deeper corruption. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort his prisoner away, she observed the remaining figures with renewed attention. Dr. Haydock's strained composure and Colonel Melchett's defensive posture suggested that the photographer's investigation had threatened more than one reputation. "Inspector," Miss Marple ventured gently, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. "I believe Mrs. Whitmore's confession, while undoubtedly sincere, reveals only part of a larger picture. Mr. Hartwell was not pursuing individual blackmail victims, but documenting a systematic enterprise that required considerable coordination and professional expertise." Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably near the fireplace, his medical bag clutched with white-knuckled intensity. The implications of Miss Marple's observation hung heavy in the afternoon air, and she continued with the patient persistence of someone who understood that truth, once begun, must be allowed to complete its development. The pattern Mr. Hartwell discovered involved convenient deaths followed by profitable property transactions, each legitimized by medical assessments that prevented inconvenient scrutiny. Such reports would require genuine professional expertise to convince official investigators. Her pale blue eyes settled on the doctor with gentle but inexorable pressure. "Dr. Haydock, your involvement began compassionately enough. Elderly patients requesting assistance with painful final illnesses. Families desperate to spare their loved ones unnecessary suffering. But the line between mercy and murder blurred gradually as financial considerations entered the equation. The confession that followed emerged with the inevitability of water finding its level." Dr. Haydock's voice was barely above a whisper as he described Mrs. Whitmore's remarkable talent for befriending isolated elderly residents, gaining their trust, encouraging generous provisions for their dear friends in the village. When natural death seemed too slow in coming, she would suggest that medical intervention might provide peaceful release from suffering. Colonel Melchett's role proved equally crucial, but more administrative. His position as magistrate allowed him to ensure that inquests proceeded smoothly, that inconvenient questions were discouraged, and that property transfers following deaths were processed without bureaucratic delays that might invite scrutiny. "We never intended it to become systematic," he protested with military stiffness. "Each case seemed isolated, justified by individual circumstances." Miss Marple nodded with apparent understanding while noting how perfectly their explanation confirmed her assessment of human nature under pressure. "Mr. Hartwell's murder was meant to preserve that system," she observed quietly. Mrs. Whitmore applied poison powder to his camera's eyepiece, using her theatrical knowledge of stage chemicals and the photographer's own meticulous habits to ensure his exposure during those final moments beneath the focusing cloth. The scent of lavender water was meant to disguise chemical odors, a thoughtful touch that ultimately betrayed her involvement. As Inspector Slack returned with additional constables to make the remaining arrests, Miss Marple reflected that the photographer's final exposure had indeed proved his most revealing. The developing image showed not merely murder, but systematic exploitation of trust and authority that had corrupted the very foundations of village life. Within days, St. Mary Mead resumed its outward rhythms, though the current running beneath was permanently altered. Tom Whitmore returned quietly to his position at the bank, his innocence vindicated, but his faith in appearances forever shaken. The brass nameplate that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock the fragility of reputation built on others' perceptions rather than personal integrity. Mrs. Clement, strengthened by her discovery of the threatening letters, sent her predecessor's papers to the diocesan chancellor with a letter that was the soul of English understatement. The vicar preached not thunderously, but with grave plainness about light and the serviceable honesty of daylight, while Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed that it was all too modern, though few agreed with her aloud. Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Bantry's gift of a white rose cutting that would, her friend declared, bloom splendidly with neglect. "Cameras are altogether too knowing," Mrs. Bantry confided. "One feels one's back hair is being discussed." Miss Marple smiled and suggested a hat with a modest brim, though her mind dwelt less on roses and hats than on the persistent truth that people generally reveal what they are while believing they have revealed nothing at all. The photographer's cottage remained shuttered while officials catalogued his papers, among them the damaged group portrait rescued from the wrecked tripod. It was imperfect, blurred at the edges, scorched in one corner, yet almost everyone appeared in it as themselves. Miss Marple kept no copy. She had no wish to arrange the living upon her mantelpiece according to how nearly their faces had betrayed them at 5 o'clock of an altogether memorable afternoon. Walking home through lanes where hedges leaned in like neighbors exchanging confidences, she considered how very nearly disaster had succeeded. The lax conscience, she reflected, depends upon chance as much as the virtuous one depends upon grace. Mr. Hartwell had believed exposure to be the end of the story, but it seldom was. One must live with what was exposed, and that remained the more difficult art. The weeks following the dramatic revelations at the vicarage settled over St. Mary Mead like morning mist, gradually lifting to reveal a landscape familiar in outline but subtly, permanently altered. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the same patient attention she had devoted to the photographer's mystery, noting how communities, like individuals, revealed their true character only when stripped of comfortable illusions. The wheels of justice. The trials proceeded with the methodical dignity that English justice demanded, though the revelations proved more shocking than even Miss Marple had anticipated. Mrs. Jennifer Whitmore's confession had opened floodgates that revealed systematic exploitation spanning nearly a decade, involving 7 elderly residents whose deaths had been hastened to facilitate profitable property transactions. The theatrical skills that had once entertained provincial audiences had been perverted into a grotesque performance of friendship and care, with death as the inevitable final curtain. The sentences, when they came, reflected both the severity of the crimes and the particular betrayal of trust they represented. Mrs. Whitmore received life imprisonment, her role as the active instrument of murder earning her the harshest punishment. Dr. Haydock and Colonel Melchett received lengthy terms that effectively ended their professional lives, transforming them from pillars of the community into cautionary tales about the corruption of authority. Individual reckonings. Tom Whitmore returned to the bank as quietly as a man may return when everyone knows his name has been on other people's tongues. He found that figures still added correctly, but that hands hesitated before the afternoon post, and that the tick of the regulator clock could sound like village judgment rendered in miniature. The £50 he had withdrawn, ostensibly for blackmail, had indeed been intended as payment, though not as Inspector Slack had assumed. Whitmore had planned to pay Mr. Hartwell to cease his investigation, fearing exposure of property. Irregularities would destroy his career even without criminal responsibility. Mrs. Clement, strengthened by her discovery of the threatening letters, had sent her predecessor's papers to the diocesan chancellor with correspondence that was the soul of English understatement. The ensuing ecclesiastical investigation led to quiet acknowledgement of past irregularities and thorough re-examination of parish records. The vicar preached with new gravity about light and the serviceable honesty of daylight, his sermons imbued with understanding born of shared vulnerability. A locum from Much Benham took over the medical rounds, a capable woman with decisive step and laugh like a bell. She measured medicines with almost cheerful justice, and people found themselves sleeping better for knowing precisely what they were given and why. In the surgery waiting room, someone had pinned a newspaper clipping behind the fern, an official notice of proceedings before the medical council. The village transformed. St. Mary Mead did what English villages do when the extraordinary has passed through like a storm. It put the milk out each morning, clipped its hedges, and spoke of the matter only when doors were safely shut. Yet beneath this surface, normalcy lay profound change. The comfortable illusion of perfect innocence had been shattered, replaced by more complex understanding of humanity's capacity for both good and ill. The photographer's cottage eventually found new purpose as the village council converted it into a small library, a place where knowledge, freely shared, might prevent shadows of ignorance from gathering again. It was a modest gesture, perhaps, but one that Miss Marple found profoundly hopeful. The excellent light that had attracted Mr. Hartwell to his final residence would now illuminate books rather than secrets, knowledge rather than blackmail. Miss Marple's wisdom. Mrs. Bantry came to tea with delicious penitence at being alive to other people's affairs, declaring that exposure was all very well in photographs, but very draughty in drawing rooms. Over seed cake, she recounted the village's current theories about the murder method, each more elaborate than the last. Miss Marple, who rarely corrected anyone directly, suggested only that ordinary things were most dangerous when used in unexpected ways. She observed that lavender water provided comfort in drawers, but alibis in murder. She remarked that gardeners, being practical theologians, knew cut stems must be kept from sunlight until they could take to water again. And she noted, as if it were nothing, that theatrical stitches were always worked from inside, so audiences saw only lines of perfection. Human nature, Dolly, Miss Marple reflected, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, is remarkably consistent. The veneer of civilization, society's rules, they are but thin coat of paint over passions existing since time began. Love, greed, fear, resentment, they drive us all. Only when those passions fester in secret, without truth's cleansing air, do they grow truly monstrous. The photographer's legacy. As autumn deepened into winter, Miss Marple considered Mr. Hartwell's complex legacy. His investigation had been intended to expose corruption for personal profit, but its ultimate effect had been to cleanse the community of cancer, slowly destroying its moral foundation. The photographer's death had silenced him permanently, yet his work had spoken with voice that could not be stilled, developing slowly but inexorably until every hidden detail stood revealed in perfect, damning clarity. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of finding proper exposure regardless of human attempts to keep it buried in darkness. Mr. Hartwell's final photograph had indeed proved his most revealing, not the group portrait he had intended to capture, but the systematic corruption his death had ultimately exposed. Life in St. Mary Mead would never be quite the same, but in this new, more honest landscape there was also newfound resilience, quiet determination to face truth, however uncomfortable. Miss Marple sat by her window as evening gathered, the scent of late roses wafting from her garden. Armed with deep understanding of human nature, keen eye for detail, and unwavering belief in truth's eventual triumph, she remained ready for whatever new dramas might unfold. For even in the quietest English villages, the human heart remained an endlessly fascinating and often deadly mystery.